Well, hello, and welcome back to Read Becca. It is time once again for my weekly chatty catch-up on everything I've read, everything I'm currently reading, and everything I'm looking forward to reading, as well as some general chit-chat and lifey catch-up. So this week I read a lot. It was a great reading week, but that also meant things were kind of dead for my week otherwise, mainly dealing with the heat. So I did, I think, mention last week that I was very near to finishing my first BookTube prize reading book for judging, and I did indeed finish that book and move on to the second. So we're skipping over that book, but I did finish an extra book this past week. Then let's dive into the books I am talking about. I read Whichwood by Tahareh Mafi. This is the sequel to Furthermore, and I had thought this was a companion novel. I think it's possible to read this on its own, but it is a very direct sequel, and throughout, Mafi makes the effort to footnote things and provide clarifying context, things that happened in the previous book that are relevant if you've missed it. So that's why I think you could read this. But very directly, we have the characters from the first book jumping into this, Whichwood is a whole other world within this land of a sequence of different types of worlds, and each of them has different rules and forms of magic of their own, and very different cultures. And so in this world, we are with Layli, who is a Mordashur, and her job is sort of something that follows her lineage, and they clean the bodies of the dead. And if they don't do that within a certain amount of the time, the ghosts of the dead remain. And so it's very much caught up in cultural death practice. And there is a certain conversation here that I feel it could have been dived into a little bit deeper, but is at least present about the dynamic between that legacy and tradition of handling death versus progress and moving forward, and the conflict or the tension between those things. So I appreciated that being here at least. But Layli is feeling very alone and really struggling with her life. So it started out pretty dark because her mother died in the past. It's been a couple of years, in fact, but is still hanging around as an angry ghost because her father couldn't, as the Mordashur of the time, get over it and was so grief-stricken that he wanted even that angry ghost to linger on, and so he never took care of the rites that he needed to do in order for her to pass on. And so she's beset by a father who's totally absent and just in his grief, and a mother who is present but horrible to her. And obviously this has a lot of real world analog and is very relatable for many people, despite it being fantastical here. And I love that distance that creates for a child to read about their own experience potentially. But then we have our characters from Furthermore show up, and they're sort of there to help, but they're children and they don't really understand this culture and tradition. And so they're often more of a hindrance or a distraction. And I don't know that I totally bought everything about that. Like, in the middle, Layli, as a character who is always very serious and really understands the weight and duty, she agrees to just sort of set things aside and go off and go to a festival, more or less, with the kids she's with from the other book. And it's like, you're going to lose your whole day and you know you're up against a tight deadline. Why would you do this? And she just sort of goes along with it without a lot of thought. And that didn't feel true to character. So there were a couple moments there that didn't feel true to character. But overall, I think I did really enjoy this. It engaged with a lot of the same topics, I think, that The Deep by Rivers Solomon does. And I love that story, but that is much more adult because that's talking about these slave women who fell overboard off slave ships and give birth in the water, and they birth mermaids. And there's this whole legacy of trauma because of that, and one person in their society has to bear the weight. And that's very much what's going on here, where she's feeling so isolated and alone and disconnected from the community that she's serving. And they don't really seem to have an idea of what's going on with both her and her family in this moment. And it does feel like there could have been a stronger commentary on that, but that's also present. So I liked the commentaries that were present, but they were subtle. I think for me, I did enjoy this a lot. And as I said, there was a lot here to like, and a lot of meat to this, a lot of great characterization, but Furthermore was a real standout for me. And this one was very good middle grade. And so it didn't feel like it was at that next echelon and didn't quite deliver to the same expectation that I had, but I still really enjoyed it and thought it was a great example of a middle grade book. Just kind of more something I would expect from a middle grade book than a stand-up. Anyway, I really liked it. Then let's go to my favorite of the week, Brighter Than Scale and Swifter Than Flame by Nian Yang, a little fantasy novella. And I'm just going to put a picture up here because the library glare is ruining the beauty of the cover. So Nian Yang is a very particular flavor, and I have enjoyed all of their work very, very much. And I did enjoy this one a lot. But almost universally, their stuff is mismarketed in some way that puts people off, or it's just not palatable to the average fantasy reader. It takes a certain type of reader, and that reader is me, apparently, because I really love this. We are following, it's kind of in a traditional fantasy world, historical feeling, but fantasy with dragons and an Asian flair to this world, certainly. But Yeva, as a little girl, has a run-in with a young dragon and kills it. And as it turns out, she finds that, in fact, she comes from a lineage, a bloodline of dragon hunters. And in this world, there is this whole academy and extreme culture of hatred for dragons, and they're trying to wipe them out, basically. But so she then, after this encounter, it's realized a little bit with heartbreak by her parents that now she has to be shipped off to go to training. And so she's disconnected from her family at that point and goes to training at this academy for sort of guild knights who hunt dragons. And that becomes her life. And we sort of speed through time to her as an adult, I think 20 years later. And she is now being sent, she's an accomplished dragon hunter, dragon knight, and she's being sent to a far-flung kingdom by the emperor. And there's been rumors that maybe there are dragons kind of coming back in this far-flung kingdom, but this kingdom also don't quite connect with the empire as much, and they have a reverence and mythology about dragons that the empire don't appreciate. And so Yeva is kind of going as this sole advocate and emissary for the empire to basically spy, keep an eye out, look for dragons, more or less. And when she gets there is this girl king that she finds immediately mysterious, and she questions her motives. The girl king is not a child, it's a woman king. And I love the dynamic between them because it is very literally the girl king being really mysterious and charismatic and taking the guard down off of Yeva. Very literally at times, because Yeva is required to wear all of this armor and a mask as part of her role. And she's slowly kind of is going around the palace without that stuff on because the girl king is convincing her. And so I don't want to get into things in the back half beyond that because it is so short and there's not a lot of plot to this. But I feel it's very, very obvious what is going to be the big reveal of this. I feel that was eminently obvious even going into this book. So if you don't expect or project something just based off of the cover and the premise that I've told you, then you'll be surprised. But anyway, so they do have a romantic relationship as well. And there was nothing salacious or anything, but like I felt like there was this beautiful, soft kind of sapphic yearning to it that I loved as well. And the trust that's built with them over time of them both sort of bringing down each other's walls was just great. But what that means is this is not the book that a lot of people are going to go into and expect. This is not about dragon hunting at all. This book does not really contain hardly any dragon hunting at all. Of course, this empire has secrets, and she's uncovering the secrets of the empire to do with dragons, but it's not about that. In fact, we completely skip over the experience at the academy. We skip over, we know she's kind of a fabled dragon hunter, but we skip over the dragon hunts, all of that basically. So none of that is present. That's all background to this foreground. That's this very personal, intimate story about this character who's been disconnected and is grappling with the relationship with her family that she used to have and what she has now, the way she's distanced herself from people. And there's also a story about disability there because she, in the initial fight with the little dragon in her childhood, her hand was damaged and has never been fully healed. And so she's always had these kind of doubts about that, about whether she can be fully present as this dragon knight and always working to strive to be more or prove people wrong, that they can't see a weakness in her. And I think there's a lot there about family and relationships and how we identify ourselves. So I loved it. I, in fact, having just read the latest Nevo book in the Singing Hills cycle, found that this was really, really similar to me in the feeling and the delivery of it to the first of the Singing Hills books, the Empress of Salt and Fortune, which I think is my favorite of those. That has a more format element to it that this doesn't. That makes me like that, I think, better. But this is also very much about someone coming in from outside to meet this woman ruler who has secrets. And so both have a lot of overlap there. And it's very quiet, very contemplative, very much interpersonal. And I just love that. So this one was great. This was a great read for me, but I don't know that it will work for the average fantasy reader. Very character driven for sure. And then finally, something I feel very conflicted about. Tribes by Sebastian Junger. I've wanted to read this for a long time, at least the premise of it. It's nonfiction. The idea of it was really appealing to me. It's only like 3 hours on audio. So I've had it on my list of short audios to get to, and I slotted it in when I just had some time between audiobooks I was waiting on. And I came out completely conflicted. It feels like he had things he wanted to talk about and join together, but also was trying to remain very objective and just present information, and didn't really build the case for anything that he was trying to do. So I came out very sort of unconvinced and confused. So I should have known a bit going in, or I had my doubts, I would say, going in, because he leads with this statement of, well, this is not an academic work, so I'm not footnoting this, but this, and this, and here's research and blah, blah, blah. And so he's going in with caveats, so that's never a good sign. And even if it's an academic work, I am of the impression that if it's a nonfiction work and you are citing someone's research, you should do that. But that initial putting me on the back foot going in, it turned out to be much, much better. This was much more based in and grounded in research. And in fact, I think mostly was presenting research. But I had a struggle with how he was joining those things together, because he is talking about topics like tribal life at the colonization of America versus the happiness of colonists, and the fact that colonists were sort of leaving in droves and going to the tribes because they were supposedly happier. Then we have modern day happiness in the average population, and things like PTSD in the veteran population compared. And then we go into sort of warrior ethos and militarism. And I, again, don't really, I know he wanted to talk about military, and I know he wants to talk about indigenous tribes, and he's trying to, it's clear he's trying to get at the idea of how do we repair connection in small groups. I don't think he made the case for that. It was very all over the place, I felt. So it felt like he kind of came at it backwards. I did get a lot of good information out of this. There was a lot of great information about studies on how happy different groups are, but I feel like he didn't ever pull the thread. And this is only 3 hours, so I can kind of understand why that is. It would have been a full-length book rather than kind of a long essay, but it feels like he needed to do that. For me, reading through this, I kept thinking about more things I wanted information about that he was not diving into. Like, he kept citing things like how certain groups are happier versus unhappy, or self-report as happier versus unhappy, versus their actual well-being. And everything that he was saying was not aligning with my sort of conclusions out of it. I would have loved to see something about that correlated against complexity or education, because to me, everything he was laying out was not drawing the conclusion that he was making. It was in fact pointing to people who have much more complex lives, are more burnt out. And in fact, Margaret Pinard was talking about a book titled Burnout this week, and about the effects of self-regulatory failure, how we're kind of just going from stressor to stressor to stressor, where in past world life, we had stress and then release cycles. So like going hunting and then having a feast. So we had delineations of stress where we don't today. And I found that tied in weirdly, she brought that up in a live stream this week, and like it tied in perfectly with something that he obviously should have drawn into this book that he didn't. He never seems to talk about that. I also weirdly, in one of my book to prize books that I was reading, it came up as well. This guy is going through burnout and kind of a midlife crisis, and he describes it as when geese are migrating, they trade off roles between being in the lead and being behind. And he says he feels like he's been the lead goose for far too long. And like that's just such a great way of describing it, because it does feel like modern day life, we are expected to be the lead goose all the time. We're expected to make high level executive function decisions all day long. And there is an appeal to simplifying life, to hierarchy, and to being a follower. But that's the appeal of cults. And that's kind of what it felt like Sebastian Junger was arguing for here, was simplicity and hierarchy and gender stereotypes, even as he was undercutting his own claim. He kept returning to indigenous societies as a positive of things that he himself had affirmed are more egalitarian and less gender hierarchical, while at the same time arguing about how we need to create these extremes of gender hierarchy. He also talked about these great examples, like he went through a litany of examples of crisis situations, and I don't really know why those were there, but crisis situations where small groups step up, more or less. That was kind of what he was going through. And in those crisis situations, he talks about the gender role expectations and how people actually behave. And very interestingly to me is that he sort of calls out the aspect that if you have all of one gender, for instance, people will step into the traditional gender role of the opposite gender. And he continues to labor on that point of it being the opposite gender's role, and fails to recognize these are societal roles. Just because we in American and Western society specifically have turned them into gendered roles doesn't mean that they're actually specifically tied to gender. So he has this very like patriarchy needs to be strengthened view, and does kind of say that at points in this. And I feel weird about that. Because it also, me saying this is very like American Western point of view of gender roles, just in general, it's very American and Western. He's looking specifically at societies within that realm, and in modern day primarily. He doesn't at any point sort of compare and look at, well, what are these societies doing differently from happier societies in our time now? Like if you're talking about happiness, what are you doing if you're not comparing to who in the world is happier right now than in the US? And he just never does that. So let me wind down, because I feel like I have been just baffling on this one for a while, waffling. I don't know. I came out of this feeling like I initially went in with that caveat statement, feeling real doubts that I was even gonna finish this. I ended up getting what I felt was a lot of pretty good information out of it. But so many of the conclusions that he drew made no sense to me and were actively undermined by things he was saying. So I don't think it was very effective as a book in general. Just, even just things that I don't feel like he is willing to go far. He mentions how, because of the way things are, and there's quite a preamble to it, soldiers that are now going into service are sort of pre-selecting or self-selecting from groups that have backgrounds that are more prone to PTSD, to be susceptible to PTSD, or lack support systems for it. And that's really, really valid to point out. And then he follows that up by saying that's not present with the draft. And those two can be factual statements without any sort of judgment or bias, right? But it feels like he's saying the draft is better because it doesn't have it. Well, why are we even entertaining that as an option? Why are we not saying, how do we not select for these people who are predisposed to be more prone to PTSD. Like, we have qualification for entry. That should be a qualification for entry if that's really a problem. We should not be letting these people who are going to be decimated for the rest of their life if they suffer trauma, right? That seems like obvious to me. Or go even further to the big problem. How do we minimize the need for soldiers? So we minimize the people even more. And he doesn't ever entertain that. But again, this is a very short book. So I feel like he doesn't go to the big solutions. And his conclusions or the things he's trying to attempt at connecting, the need for a more small tribe-based society would magically make us all happier, I don't feel is necessarily effectively communicated or built as a case. So I feel conflicted and confused by this one, but I did get a lot of good information out of it, and it made me think a lot. And so reading books you don't necessarily agree with entirely is always good for that, I think, or often good for that, I think. So this one was not a winner. Anyway, onward. Let's move on to the stuff I'm reading right now. I'm working on The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe, German. I'm listening to What You Need Is in the Library, or What You Need You Can Find in the Library, something like that. Long, cozy, with cat on the cover, though I have not encountered any cats in the book yet, I don't think. So I think I got cat baited. Anyway, so I'm listening to that. I'm also reading my second BookTube Prize book. So that's what's going on with books. What I watched this week, I watched a couple of great things. I watched the movie Bohemian Rhapsody. It was totally engrossing. I really enjoyed it. And I did that thing where you kind of turn it on to put it at the front of your watching list so that you can come back to it, because I was about to go to bed. And I ended up accidentally watching the whole thing. And it's like two hours, over 2 hours. It's very long. And it was just like so magnetic, which is perfectly true to Freddie Mercury. This is obviously the biopic about Freddie Mercury and his band Queen. And I just loved it. It felt very true to him, both the highs and lows. The band and his connection was so well laid out, and the way that even through conflict and hardship, they kept gravitating back toward each other, and they remained a support for one another through a lot. So I really enjoyed that. The other thing I watched was also something I very much enjoyed, was Kipo and the Age of Wonder Beasts. This is an animated series DreamWorks did, and it's on Netflix right now, but it is leaving, and that's why I watched it. And it's got short episodes, so you could probably pretty easily binge through it if you are wanting to before it leaves Netflix. But this was so good. It's kind of post-apocalyptic, and Kipo is this teenage girl who lives in a burrow with her family and other people in a world where the surface of the earth is not so safe because it's sort of run by mutes or mutant animals. And some of them talk, and they formed clans, and all of the animals are sort of fighting with each other, but especially they all hate humans pretty much. So it's not a very safe place for humans. So that's why Kipo and her people live in burrows. But of course, the beginning of the show, she ends up getting flung out of her burrow for reasons, and needs to find her way back, more or less, or find her way to her family, and ends up on the surface getting the help of other people and mutes, and basically tries to befriend everyone. She is so naive and is always like the most hopeful person, and everybody else is just like, we're gonna die every time. And it's so great. It's very, very silly. It's also full of music. It's got a great soundtrack. This is almost exactly like Sweet Tooth, which is based on a comic and was a live action movie, or not movie, series for Netflix as well, which I love. That one has a great soundtrack to it as well, but this has actual musical numbers, I think, in every episode, and I love that. I'm just a sucker for a musical number, so I enjoyed this so much. It's bright and colorful and has all of these animal characters that are talking. Great voice cast too. Dan Stevens is the villain. Like, he's such a good villain. It kind of makes me want to go rewatch Legion, because he's so great in that. Yeah, it's just a great, entertaining show. I really enjoyed it. And I think that's it for what I watched this week. Other things in my week were just mainly the heat. That kind of suppressed me doing very much of anything, though I did get into the shelter and walk dogs a lot, and that is especially hard with the heat because we can only take them out for a couple minutes at a time. But very, very luckily, I think I mentioned maybe last week or the week before, that it feels like everybody got out of school and their families realized they need something to do and came to adopt dogs. So like 2 weeks ago, we came in to walk for my regular group that are together, and every kennel run was full, because we have sort of 6 main areas of kennel runs, and then a small dog area as well. And we were this week down to just one kennel run. So that was hardly any dogs. It was wonderful to have had that many get adopted in 2 weeks. That's amazing. And a bunch of the long-time dogs, well, almost all of them are gone because like we were down to so few. Even the kennel run that we had, they had half moved new puppies in there from the small dog area because it was overheating in the small dog area, unfortunately, earlier this week, and they were having major problems, so they kind of had to move people around. But they had so much open space because everywhere else is pretty much empty. So yay for dogs getting adopted. I'm so happy that we had a lot of good adoptions. And we're down to not having to take out a ton of dogs. It was so funny because all of us with glasses were like giving each other tips and tricks about, as soon as you go out the door, your glasses just fog immediately because it's so humid. And because we can only go out for short walks, we're just constantly going in and out. And so like I have some spray for it, the defogging spray, so I need to go hunt that down, and I just haven't this week. But I did finally get to a project that I hadn't meant to. I probably shouldn't have done it while it was ridiculously hot because I got grossly sweaty doing it, but it was worthwhile. I took the housing off my washer, or I moved everything out and cleaned, of course, in my whole little laundry room. I have like a mud room with my laundry stuff off of my garage, and cleaned, got everything put back, and took apart the housing around my washer to try and figure out problems with not spinning or draining fully. And I think it's just my washer being old at this point, because I bought my house in 2009, I think, and at that point they didn't want to come lower on the price, but I wanted them to, and they were not willing to. And so I was like, okay, you're gonna throw in the washer and dryer so I don't have to deal with getting one, and I think these are gonna last. And they have since 2009, and they were old already at that point. So that has been a worthwhile decision. But now they're getting to have problems, and I do think it probably is just something I'm gonna have to live with until I decide I'm done with it and buy a new one. But at this point, I ruled out a bunch of things by taking the housing off, taking stuff apart, taking all of the hoses off. And thankfully, when I put it back together, I did not end up with any leaks. I was totally expecting when I put the hoses back on, something was gonna be leaking. So I had towels there and everything ready so I could troubleshoot it later. But no, I put it all back together right. And so now I've ruled out a bunch of stuff but not fixed anything. So I'm going to next have to take apart the drum. I exceeded my energy for the day with what I did already. So taking apart the drum is another whole project. And then we will probably get to the point of deciding, do I just toss it and be done and replace it, or can I do anything with what I find? So anyway, that was my not so exciting week. So I think that is it for me today. And with that, I will wish you a wonderful week in reading and in life. And thank you so very much for watching.